Hello, my name is David Trembath and I'm joining you from the lands of the Kumbameri people, who are the traditional owners and custodians of this land on which I'm joining you today. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging and extend that deep respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, including those who may be joining today. Thank you for joining this seminar, which is hosted by CliniKids as part of our commitment to and our enthusiasm for connecting and sharing information for supporting children and families and all of those who support them. In this seminar, I'll be talking about current best practice in supports for autistic children with a particular focus on the approach, the experience and the outcomes to strive for. So CliniKids brings together clinical services, research and training opportunities aimed at supporting the learning, participation and wellbeing of autistic children and their families. We're a team of over 50 professionals, including clinicians, client support officers, researchers, students and operations staff based predominantly in Western Australia and Queensland, but with partnerships across the country and indeed around the world. CliniKids is a registered NDIS provider and offers early support services including speech pathology, occupational therapy and clinical psychology for children aged 0 to 8 years of age. And families also have the opportunity to be involved in our current research. CliniKids also runs information sessions for caregivers in addition to professional training in specific therapies and assessment tools for clinicians and other professionals working in this field. So if you'd like to learn more about CliniKids, please visit our website. So I was invited to present on this topic several months ago, and I've been thinking since then about the best way to approach it, because a presentation like this can be challenging, because the goal is to cater for a number of different audiences, different people. Should I talk about the latest research evidence, describe the vast array of support options, should reflect on the changing landscape of service and supports, or the shifts in practice towards more affirming and right-based and personalised approaches? Then I was having a conversation with a parent who made the good point that there's already a lot of good information available. For example, there are the 2 Autism CRC national guidelines, one for assessment and diagnosis and one for supports for autistic children and their families. And there's the information provided by Autism Awareness Australia, the Raising Children Network, our own resources at CliniKids and a whole range of other organisations and service providers who provide information to the community. So this parent suggested that what might be most helpful to families and those who support them if I share more of my personal reflections on what best practice looks like. So I'm going to take this approach. While I'll draw heavily on the national guidelines, research evidence and evidence from the community, I'll share some of my personal reflections based on what I've seen and observed and read and watched and learned over the course of my career. I'll do my best to talk very plainly about what I think works best and why. So I might start by sharing an approach I use when working out what supports might be helpful and answer a number of frequently asked questions about what type of supports, how much and in what ways. And as I do, I'll focus on 3 elements of best practice that I believe as a field we should be concentrating on. The first is the approach. We want approaches that are safe, effective and desirable to children and families. We need to focus on the experience. It needs to be responsive and helpful and respectful. And when it comes to the outcomes, well, learning, participation and wellbeing should be the focus. But to begin with, I might share an example of what I believe to be one of the most effective approaches to supporting a child and family that I've seen over the course of my career, and what I think we can learn from it. So this support doesn't have a name, and in fact you can call it whatever you like, as there are so many different terms used in the field, such as therapy and support and program and approach. As a general rule, I suggest not getting too caught up in terms of which term to use, so long as we're talking about something that is safe and effective and desirable to children and families. And I make this point because there's a lot of talk about terminology in the field at the moment and some very strident views, and it's really important that the words we use are safe and inclusive and respectful and accurate. But I'm also concerned that sometimes I see 90% of the time and the energy spend talking about the words and only 10% of the time talking about the actions, and I'm worried that this can lead to a waste of time, energy and opportunity. It's also a fact that terms have evolved and will continue to do so into the future. So when it comes to talking about children in this presentation, I'll use a combination of identity first language and person first language, reflecting the mixture of approaches that individual parents and children themselves use. And if we were working together individually, I generally mirror the language that you use. So back to the support. How about I'll give it a simple name. Perhaps I'll try and be a little bit catchy. I'll call it POPs, which is an acronym for People, Opportunities, Places and Spaces. So POPs is primarily a community-based support, meaning it's focused on helping kids be part of regular childhood activities. To the greatest extent possible, POP sees children out and about in the community, learning and being part of all the experiences that are part of a typical childhood in a particular culture or community and context. And I'm talking here about play, time with family and friends, early childhood education and care, or childcare for support, being in parks and shopping centres, playgrounds and so on. So there are 7 defining characteristics of the POPs approach. The first is that it reflects the best available evidence from research. For example, it's personalised, it's strengths-based, and fosters learning, participation and wellbeing. POP is affirming in every way and consistent with the national guidelines for supporting autistic children and their families when it comes to learning, participation and wellbeing. Second thing about POP is it honours children's human right to learn, to education in all of its forms. And I realise this might seem obvious, but unfortunately there are some people in society today who seek to deny children access to early evidence-based supports. The common argument, which I think is often well-meaning but unfortunately misguided, is that early supports seek to change a child, to make them different in some way, to stop them being who they are. And in fact, it's the opposite that is true. Early support seeks to help children be exactly how they are, to experience and explore all parts of childhood, and to develop their own confidence and capacity to express their needs, their wants, their preferences and their aspirations and their desires, so they can set their own course in life. The third thing about POPs is it honours and affirms the rights of parents to be parents. It respects the extraordinary bond, the connection, the responsibility that comes with being a parent. And this includes all caregivers in the role, whether they're a family member, guardian or another role. Unfortunately, there are also some people in the community who are repeating the mistakes of the past, blaming parents for seeking support, seeking to take away their rights and responsibility to act in the best interests of their own children, or even suggesting that they know their children better than their parents do. Fortunately, we're talking about a small minority, but the messages are dangerous. That by seeking support, parents are in some way wrong or hurting their kids. It's the cruelest accusation that can be levelled against any parent. We know that as parents, our children are the most beautiful, precious and special people in our lives. And in fact, we're biologically wired and uniquely positioned to understand, to love and to support them. So when it comes to therapies and supports, we must honour and affirm the rights of parents to make decisions about their own lives and the lives of their children in support of their children. As we say in AFL, we've got to get up, we've got to get around parents and support them in the job that they're doing, that many of you are doing. So the fourth thing about POPs is it reflects the best insights, evidence and strategies from education and allied health practice. We know that the most effective way to learn new skills is to do so in natural, personally meaningful and relevant contexts as part of daily life. And POPs does this by giving children the opportunity to meet, experience and or learn from as many people, places and spaces as possible. This isn't to say that kids are thrown in the deep end, not at all. Absolutely not. We know that new people, places and spaces can be very challenging for kids due to differences in the way they experience, understand and interact with other people in the world around them. But POPs also doesn't deny kids the opportunity to experience all the parts of childhood, all the parts of life. doesn't assume that just because a child enjoys familiarity and sameness and routines, they should not have the new opportunities to explore and see what grabs their attention, their interest, even grabs their heart. It's just that POPs does it really gradually, gently, with a perfect, personalised combination of familiar experiences and new ones that gradually but surely opens up the world and all the opportunities, the choices, and well-being that follows. The fifth thing about POPs is it reflects the best available evidence from the community. In fact, it was co-produced by members of both the autistic community, meaning people who identify as autistic, and broader autism community, which includes all of those who support them. POPs honours, respects and promotes the rights, preferences and priorities of the individual child and family. It's like a wraparound approach because it considers the strengths and the challenges of the child and family and all of the parts of their lives that they wish to share. The sixth thing about POPs is that it's collaborative. And by this I mean that the people using POPs seek to work with other people who are willing and able to help the child be part of a full range of childhood activities, such as inclusion in childcare and then school, being out and about in the community and forming connections with people and places, and passions and spaces. But irrespective of what specialist supports are provided, they're always aimed at supporting the child's learning, participation and wellbeing as part of daily life. And the seventh, the final thing about POPs, which I think is important to note, is that it's not ideologically driven. It doesn't tell people what to think, and it doesn't claim to have all the answers. The POPs approach is simply to focus on the here and now, but with an eye to the future and a deep and insightful understanding of the past. POPs seeks to understand what could make the biggest difference in the child and family's life today and tomorrow, and work in practical ways to make that happen. So you might be wondering, where can I get it? Well, the answer is, the chances are it's already around you. So here's a picture of the one provider I know really well. He goes by the name of Pop. And alongside incredible, Nan and an uncle who's a crazy Cronulla Sharks fan, and a whole family on both sides, they've been implementing the POPs people, places, opportunities, spaces approach for years now, at playgrounds and on trains, at home and childcare, in car parks, shopping centres, waiting rooms, pools, all sorts of places across town. And the positive effects for this young person have been enormous. And I'm sharing this with you to make the point that in all the years working in this space and thinking about all the kids and families I've had the privilege to learn from, and everything I've seen and read and come to understand, I guess the thing I've come to understand most is that parents and family have always been and will always be the most important people in a child's life. And it doesn't need to be Pop or Nan or a footy mad uncle, but what I do hope for parents watching is that you do have special people in your lives, whether they're related or unrelated, who can help in these types of ways. And I'm also saying this to acknowledge and say out loud that you're right to make the time and invest the energy in these connections to the greatest extent possible, including with your family and friends and other parents of children living with disability who understand, these people who care about and support you, and people who will be there for you. Service providers can play an important role and in lots of different ways, but the starting point for all supports is always close to home. But I also want to be clear that for many children and families, having amazing people in your lives isn't enough. As a society, we need to do more to ensure that when needed, you have access to high quality, mainstream, foundational and specialist supports. I think this is an important point to make, because sometimes when a child has really strong support from family and family-like people, it can appear that they're doing better than they would be without this enormous individual and unpaid involvement. In addition, there's sometimes the explicit or implicit insinuation that parents, family members, and family-like people should become therapists and move outside of your roles as loving supporters. There's a lot of nuance here, but if I can just say it very plainly, all children need love and support from family and family-like people, but many will also need additional services and support if they're to have the same opportunities for learning, participation and wellbeing as other kids the same age in their culture, community and context. And as a community, we should be ready to provide that support. So just to summarise what I've said so far, supports can be very helpful to kids and families, and children have a right to learn, to participate and to have good quality of life and wellbeing. Parents and other givers should be empowered to make informed choices. They should be supported to do so. Family and family-like people provide an extremely important foundation for support, but often additional support may be needed, with the type and the amount tailored to the individual strengths and needs of each child and family. So let's shift gears a little now. In preparing for this presentation, I reached out to the amazing CliniKids clinical team to ask them to share the questions that parents and caregivers commonly ask. So what I'll do now is I'll attempt to answer these questions, thinking at all times about the approach, the experience of children and families and the outcomes we should be striving for. I've taken this approach with the presentation to incorporate the questions into the presentation and hopefully some good answers, rather than the more traditional approach of having a presentation followed by just a small number of questions and answers that may or may not be relevant to the broader group of people watching. So, first question, when should support start? Well, I hope from my example just now that it's clear that support naturally starts from the moment a child is born, and in fact even before that. I want to be crystal clear on this. Yes, there may be a date on which formal support, such as working with an allied health professional, starts, but there never was a day in your child's life that you were not supporting them. And it's a really important point to make, because I know a lot of parents say that they feel guilty or worried for not doing X or Y or Z at a particular time or in a particular way, that they should have known or started support sooner. Please know that you'll have been doing everything right. You'll have already been supporting your child, even if you didn't realise it, and that there is no specific age or time or window to start support. We used to talk about early intervention, that support should start as soon as possible, and while, really well-meaning, it's had some negative effects. I think the biggest is that it's made some parents feel like they missed an opportunity, which isn't true, as I've just mentioned. But the second is that it goes against the personalised approach to support that we know is best practice. It doesn't mean, though, that as a community that we should kind of take a wait-and-see approach. Instead, we should be keeping an eye on kids as they grow. And in Australia, we're very fortunate to have some good systems for this, such as check-ins with maternal child health nurses and a primary care network. It's not to say it can't be better, but it's a good start. And so when a child is growing and showing signs of developmental differences or delay, they can be explored. And when I say developmental differences, I'm not talking here about individual variability. It's part of the beauty of life that everyone is an individual, a little bit different to the next person, even in the same family, even in identical twins. And there's never a question about celebrating these individual differences, or there should never be a question about that. But what I'm talking about here is developmental differences that can have an impact on health or a functional impact on learning, participation and well-being, such as a delay in the development of spoken language or motor development or learning or cognition. The way I think about it is that support should start when a gap emerges or is likely to emerge between where a child is at and where their peers are at when it comes to their health, their learning, participation and or their well-being. For example, a child may not be engaging as much, not be as physically well, maybe finding things more challenging than other kids their age, even when we take into account the often very broad developmental windows that occur in childhood, in which children acquire skills. So taking this approach, support for all children naturally starts from day one with family. Monitoring for developmental differences or delays should also start from day one, but in the community. Informal support, such as the involvement of specialists, typically starts when a gap emerges or is likely to emerge between a child's health and development, their learning, participation and wellbeing, and that of other kids the same age. So I hope this makes sense. But I can also imagine that kind of the talk of the different types of supports might be a bit confusing. So let's now unpack that a little. So the way I see it, there are 4 main types of supports. The first is the support that comes from your family and family-like people. And in fact, supporting families is, in my view, the single most effective way to support children. I've spoken a fair bit about this already, so from here I'll tend to focus mostly on supports outside the family. The second type of support comes from people in various places and spaces your child is in as part of regular childhood activities. These are the playgroup coordinators, swimming teachers, the librarians running a story time, early childhood educators, and strangers in the community. These are people who we talk about in terms of being universal supports or mainstream supports, meaning they're kind of provided in the same way for all children. It should be accessible to all children. The third type of support, though, helps to ensure that children with additional needs can be part of these regular childhood activities. So these supports help bridge the gap between where a child with additional needs is at and their peers, such as through adjustments or training for staff or changes to the environment, perhaps some different equipment. This is what I would call foundational supports, in that they help ensure that the firm foundations are available to all children. The fourth type of support, it draws on some additional expertise and resources where children have needs that go beyond what is possible for those providing foundational supports to deliver. For example, a child may have complex medical needs or require equipment or people with training to keep them healthy. A child may have behaviours that place themselves and or other people at risk and require specialist support to keep them and to keep others safe. Or a child may be using minimal or no speech and require augmentative and alternative communication. So there are these 4 types of supports. But some of the most common questions people have are then which ones or how much and for how long. To answer these questions, I'll share a method that I personally used to think about the different types of supports in children's lives. So the way I approach it is to map out a typical fortnight in your child and family's life, or if you're a professional, the child and family you're working with. I'd encourage you to break each week up into days and hours, and then, just in a general sense, write down the things that happen across the 2 weeks for the child. Essentially, you're trying to capture where they are, who they're with, and for what purpose. For example, you might mark into it that they're at your sister's house for a play date, they go to childcare, or they have a session with an allied health professional in a clinic, they have some free time at home, and so on. It doesn't have to be perfect. Things change, of course, and in my experience, no 2 weeks of kids ever looks quite the same. But the point is, taking this sort of approach gives you a sense of the mix of things that tend to happen in your child's life over that period of time. So let's now look at 3 things. What is the goal for each activity? Does the activity match the goal? And what level of support is available? Okay, let's start by looking at the goals. When it comes to goals, we're thinking about learning, participation and wellbeing. For example, let's say that one of your child's activities is seeing an occupational therapist once a fortnight. What's the main reason you're going? That is, what's the goal? It might be, for example, that it provides a chance to help your child develop new skills that they can then use in daily activities. The goal then might be mainly about learning new skills. Another activity though in the week might be attending a playgroup. And what's the main goal for this? Learning, participation or wellbeing. For this, you might say it's less about learning new skills, although that's great if it happens. It's more about simply being among other children, playing. That is, it's all about their participation. What about, though, their well-being? Let's say you regularly take your child to the local pool because she or he loves swimming. There's nothing more relaxing than going swimming because it makes them feel relaxed and improves their well-being. So here, the goal is about their well-being. And naturally, all of the goals are linked, right? For example, going to the pool, it's important for the child's well-being, but in doing so, your child is learning to swim and being out and about in the community at the same time while being at the pool. So there's learning and participation opportunities as well. But I tend to think that identifying the main goal for each activity makes it a bit easier to look at everything that happens in a fortnight. So the next step then is to check that each activity actually matches the goal. So let's say, for example, your child is seeing several different specialists over the course of a fortnight, different allied health providers or educators and so forth. Your goal is to support your child's participation in everyday activities, but the sessions focus mainly on developing specific skills, and you're finding it hard to see how these skills they learn in a clinic carry over to the places and spaces that are most challenging at the moment for them in the community. In this case, you might have a mismatch between the goal and the actual activities that you're doing to achieve it. Alternatively, you might look at the fortnight and recognise that with everything going on, there's actually very little time to simply focus on your child's well-being. You might decide to rebalance things a little by creating a little more space in the week for the people, the places and spaces and activities they simply love to do, where the main goal is all about enjoyment and well-being. So, having looked at the goals and the activities and ensuring a good mix and they match, the next step is to think about the level of support that's available in each of them. And for this, I use a colour coding system. Green means that the level of support is about right. This might be the knowledge and skills of the person, the adjustments that have been made in that particular environment, and so on. When it's green, I'm confident that the level of support matches the need and the purpose. For example, let's say your child's spending 2 hours a week on a Friday morning at your sister's house while you're at work. The goal or the purpose is connection with family, as well as support for you while you're working. We might think of this, though, from a child's point of view as well-being. You're not overly concerned if your child learns specific skills. You're happy for them just to participate, for example, to play in a way that works for them and your sister during that time. Really, this is about well-being, connection to family, as well as your own well-being in terms of capacity to work to reduce financial pressures. So the question is, what knowledge and skills and experience does your sister need? Well, nothing really. Just by being your sister and your child's auntie, she's completely qualified. This means we colour it green. The support is great and there's nothing to change in this case. But let's now say that your child is using self-injurious behaviour to communicate when they're feeling stressed out. Being away from home, even though it's your sister's house, is familiar. It may be stressful. There may be different people and sounds and smells and activities and so on. It might be that familiar things such as how to ask for food or to get help, they happen differently there. In this case, your sister may feel a bit overwhelmed when it comes to supporting your child in terms of their own safety. She absolutely knows how to love and care for your child, there's no question about that, but she doesn't really know what to do when your child starts hitting their head to express frustration. In this case, you might colour it orange to indicate like there are great foundations, but your sister is asking for some extra help and advice. Perhaps the child's psychologist could provide some advice on this. Now let's, for argument's sake, take it a step further. Say that your sister will be away for a couple of weeks, but that a family friend of hers and yours is happy to mind the kids during that regular time. She's a great person, you love her dearly, but she has no experience looking after your child by herself, and you also don't want to put that responsibility onto her. In this case, you might colour the square red for the time being, meaning that at this point in time, it's just not a very good match between the activity and the support that's available. So taking this approach, you can end up with various combinations, goals, activities, and supports. Our goal is to see if we can get to the point where every square or part of the calendar has a purpose. And please, to be really clear, the purpose can be sleeping, relaxing, playing, meal times, and so on. I'm not talking about formal services. And that as many boxes are green or heading in that direction. And also that, I guess, no boxes are red. Or if they are, they're things that we can focus on. And when we look across all the boxes, generally we'd see the majority are filled with family type supports and mainstream supports, which, just to remind you, are regular parts of childhood, people, places and spaces. The number of boxes that include foundational or specialist supports will depend on the specific strengths and support needs of your child and family. By approaching it in this way, we're in a better position to be really clear about the goals, to consider the fit between the goals and the activities, to consider the fit between the support available and the support that's needed, then to think about what parts do we want to keep, what parts might we want to change, looking at the whole mixture of activities and supports, how does it all come together? And, if needed, consider if there might be some gaps, and if so, what types of support might be appropriate. It might be a change in the goal, it might be a change in the activity, or the support that's available, or a combination of those. So people often ask me then, how much support should I seek for my child? And looking at this, taking this approach, I hope it's obvious why it's so hard and indeed kind of impossible for people to say that all children should have X amount of support per week. First of all, do they mean support from the family, mainstream support, foundational supports or specialist supports? This question, I reckon, causes more heartache, more confusion and more well-meaning but kind of misguided decisions than perhaps any other in this space or this field right now. Some people say that children should have X hours of specialist support, but it will depend on the goals, the activities they do as part of childhood, their existing strengths and capacities of people in those activities, the mixture of goals, activities and supports across the week, and of course their individual strengths and challenges as part of their life situations. Some people cite research suggesting that X hours is better than Y, or that there should be a minimum of A or a maximum of B. The national guideline says that decisions about support should be personalised, and that there can be risks if there is too little or too much support. And this makes sense when we look across the week and consider the individual strengths and needs and circumstances of each child and family. So can you see why providing a simple number for all children and families is not appropriate? To me, it just doesn't make sense. People often ask me how many hours of support should be provided with NDIS through funding. Parents, share the heartache with me about supports being cut because of a lack of evidence when the research was never conducted on with or specifically for the child and family. They talk about having to argue and advocate for a particular amount of support. It's good to remember that the NDIS was established in large part out of recognition that the supports being provided to children, young people and adults living with disability in the community were terribly inadequate, and that this needed to change. So you can imagine then how it really concerns me when I hear people say things like, children are being over-serviced, the scheme's too expensive, we need to cut back supports. This is my personal view, but I just think we can't let pockets of poor practice and the confusion about how to answer the question around the amount of support lead us to throw our hands up in the air and simply say, it's too hard, it's too much, let's cut it back. What we need to do, in my view, is just reframe the questions of what and why, and the question of amount will then become somewhat self-evident. In my view, a more appropriate way to approach it is to ask, What would help the family? For this, there could be packages of support, including information, guidance, in some cases developing new skills if desired and appropriate, as well as respite support. The second part would be, what will it take to ensure the child is safe and well? Getting back to basics, for this, there may be packages of support related to training and equipment, modifications, supervision, skill development for those people around them. Third thing is, what will it take to ensure that the child's able to access and be included in, enjoy and benefit from early childhood education and care? For this, there may be packages of support relating to training for staff, in-centre assistance and personalised planning. And finally, what will it take for the child to be able to access at least one organised out-of-home activity, such as sport, recreation type activities? And for this, there might be programs and packages of support to foster and support inclusion. So if we set these types of parameters, the way forward becomes much easier to map out, and we can then unite our efforts and resources around these 4 objectives. We focus on the child and the family functioning, not arbitrary test scores. We focus on practical solutions and leave the ideology at the door. I share this because I do think it would be a better way to organise funding and systems of support, but also because if you were to ask me what supports you should access and how much, I'd give you basically the same answer. I'd encourage you to tap into supports that are helpful to your family. I'd encourage you to prioritise your child's health and wellbeing, and I know you'd do this, but I think it's important to recognise the importance of this and for governments and providers to also prioritise this. Health and wellbeing provides the foundation for all of the growth in activities, participation and wellbeing. I'd encourage you to try to access early childhood education and care. And here I'm talking about the full range of options. Mainstream's terrific and the obvious choice for most, but I've also seen some exceptionally effective, semi-supported and fully supported early childhood education and care settings that cater specifically for children with additional needs. I worry that sometimes ideology runs counter to the best interests, the choices and control of children and families. And sometimes a more supported setting is in fact more inclusive for some of our children. So finally, I'd encourage you to seek to have your child participate in at least one organised out-of-home activity, such as music, sport or culturally relevant activities. I appreciate this is sometimes a really big goal and challenging, but I think it's part of childhood that may be something we can strive towards, and it's the responsibility of the community to make options available to you and your children. If you can make these things happen in your week, it's going to already be quite full, and you'll know that there are countless hours in the week in which your child is receiving support from you and those around them in one way or another. But please also know that this is a general advice and approach. I know, and I've worked with children whose needs are so profound and circumstances so complex that what I'm suggesting here may sound a little bit simplistic. It's not intended to be that way. All I'm trying to do is to provide some general advice, a framework that the majority of families can perhaps use, but at all times knowing that support needs to be personalised, including where children require really close supervision and support just to be safe, let alone to be involved in activities and increase their participation. So let's get back to some more specific questions. Does my child need to have a diagnosis before I can get supports for them? No, a diagnosis of one or more conditions can sometimes be helpful in explaining differences in their development, but rarely does it substantially alter the support provided. The different types of support should be individualised for each child and start if and when each of those supports is needed. I appreciate that the system needs to catch up here, but from what I'm seeing, things are hopefully moving in this direction. We think more about children's needs and strengths in everyday activities and less about diagnoses. So there are so many different organisations and individuals who provide supports. How do I know which one to choose for my child? Well, my advice here is that having mapped out what happens over a typical fortnight and keeping in mind those 4 priorities I mentioned, you'll be in a better position to know what you need and to decide which people and or organisations are in the best position to provide it. When it comes to organisations though, they need to be professional, and that includes having appropriate safeguarding in place and ensuring that there are no conflicts of interest. For example, if they do an assessment which essentially recommends the support they provide, and doesn't suggest alternatives or even consider those, there might be some warning signs there. They should have policies in place to ensure you and your child's privacy and safety, and they should be employing people who have the knowledge, the skills, the experience, the right attitudes and the confidence and competence to work in ways that are safe and effective with your child and desirable to you and your child, your family. For professionals you work with, they need to be a good fit with you, your child and your goals. I suggest you should be aiming for alignment on 3 things. The approach, so is what they're offering you safe and effective and desirable to you and your child? Is it being provided by people who are competent? When it comes to the experience, do you and your child feel safe and respected? Is it positive and affirming and responsive to your strengths, needs, your community and culture and context? And when it comes to outcomes, are the goals and the outcomes realistic? Are they meaningful to you and your child? Are they achievable? Are they worth the cost of time, energy, and money? For parents who've been navigating and accessing services supports, I imagine some of you may have had the unfortunate experience of coming across service providers that almost make you feel like you and your child are a commodity, customers to be acquired and retained, and that you're told that within that service as a one-stop shop they can provide everything you need. In fact, you may have been pressured to purchase everything that they offer. I hope, however, you've also experienced the complete opposite, and if you haven't, please look for it. The field is full of incredibly passionate and dedicated, ethical and conscientious providers. It's just that sometimes they're not the biggest, the loudest. They don't make unfounded claims. They're just working steadily in partnership over time, rather than sort of flare up and flame out. This aspect of partnership, of seeking to connect with and support parts of everyday life, not take children away from these, it's so critically important, this way of working. So it feels overwhelming. There are so many different options. I don't know what to choose, and I don't want my child to miss out. Absolutely, it is true. There are many different therapies, interventions, programs, supports out there, and it can be very difficult to navigate and cause a lot of stress. But perhaps it can make it a bit simpler if we use an analogy of, say, shopping for a particular product at the supermarket and navigating and selecting from the options available. So imagine we have a goal of wanting to prepare a meal and you decide that you'll make pasta. And for this, you'll need some dried pasta from the supermarket. Even before you step outside your home, you know that when you get to the supermarket, there'll be a number of options to choose from. They'll all do essentially the same thing, but there might be some specific requirements you need. Things you need to take into account. So let's say, for example, your child only eats penne pasta. You'll give up on spirals and fettuccine and spaghetti, not this time anyway. Or your child may have celiac disease, which is an autoimmune condition that means they cannot eat gluten. So that will narrow the options further, but even still, there's likely to be some choices to make, such as the size of the packet or the brand and so on. At the supermarket, you can be confident that every item on the shelf meets Australian standards. So long as you work through your own requirements, you'll be fine to pick something off the shelf, to make a choice and then go home and cook the meal. And we make these types of decisions as consumers every day. So now let's think about how that relates to supports, because it's actually quite a similar process. We start with a goal, for example, to support your child's communication. And then you think about the activity, or in other words, like the parts of the week that you want to focus on most. And this might be where communication is the greatest challenge and or where you see the greatest opportunities for growth. And you might decide that you'd like to focus on communication at home to help your child express their needs and wants and preferences, perhaps around meal times. So now you're in a better position to shop because you know what you're essentially looking to achieve. You're able to look for supports that might be helpful. And so like in this case, when it comes to communication, speech pathologists are a natural choice. So you might look on the Speech Pathology Australia, find a speech pathology search tool, do your own research, talk with friends, talk with other professionals and so on to explore the different options that are available in your community and perhaps online as well. It's important though, just I think to pause here for a moment, because when it comes to finding people to support your child, unfortunately, unlike a supermarket, the quality of services and support can vary in the community. So I suggest go with mainstream services and supports, establish professional groups that have clear requirements in terms of training and competency and professional development, including ethics requirements and processes. In recent times, we're seeing an increasing trend where people are marketing themselves as experts in areas that they really have no specific training. For example, I recently heard of a provider offering cooking classes on the basis it will support children's communication development. Now, don't get me wrong, there can absolutely be some benefits of a cooking class when it comes to communication. But if the goal is to get guidance around how best to support your child's communication, you really should be working with people who know the intricacies of how communication develops, the differences in development, the challenge children can experience, and the evidence-based approaches to supporting it. What I'd suggest is that when it comes to situations where the goals are critically important, the stakes are kind of high and the children do need support, and resources are limited, we should always prioritise the most plausible, practical, desirable to you and your child, and defensible in terms it'll stand up over time options that are available. And this is exactly what the National Guideline says about making decisions about supports. So let's jump back to the example. At this point, you're looking at the various options, just like selecting from pasta options at the supermarket. You've arrived at the correct bay because you know the goal and you know generally the activities that you're targeting. The right bay in the supermarket, the part of the shelf. And you may find that speech pathologist services, while all fundamentally the same, they do come in some different varieties. For example, some speech pathologists will offer a clinic-based service, or a home or centre-based service, or online via telehealth. Some may work privately on their own, or others as part of a team. Some will have lots of experience and some less experience. And they might work differently. For example, some may use a particular type of interventional support, what we sometimes call a packaged approach, while others will draw on and combine a range of different intervention strategies. This can feel kind of overwhelming, but please just keep in mind, by starting with your goal and the activities in mind, you immediately narrow the range of options that you need to consider. And then by sticking with reputable, competent, appropriate people, you can also further narrow the focus of options that you need to consider. And once you're at this point, you can be confident that all supports are likely to be safe and effective. So it's more a matter of now just making a personal judgment. And I guess the final thing here is keep in mind, just like anything, you can always change your mind. You might need to try it, see how it feels, see whether it's a good fit for you and your child. And if it's not, it's okay to try a different option. So there is a lot to consider here, but I hope it makes sense and gives you a way forward. When it comes to selecting supports, to summarise, I suggest start with a typical fortnight. Reflect on how it is now and how you'd like it to be for your child and family. Prioritise things that support your family, your child's health and safety, your child's connection to the community through early childhood education and care or school, and try to include an organised activity outside of the home. Once you're clear on these things, I think the question of who to approach and so on becomes so much easier to make yourself and for others around you to help guide you in that decision-making process. So what evidence-based options are available? I've talked in relatively broad terms here, and I imagine some of you would like more information about choosing support options. The national guideline is very helpful in this way, but there are also other resources. For example, our team have done a lot of work in this space, looking at different types of supports and describing them and categorising and looking at how well they work and for whom and why, and all of these sorts of things, including looking at potentially negative effects. This is kind of a whole seminar on its own, and our team will be doing more in this space. But I can say that recently, one of our team members, Dr. Man Lim, who's a practice lead in psychology at CliniKids, she did a podcast with Kind on this very topic, how to choose evidence-based supports. And so we'll make sure to provide a link to you in this presentation. So let's quickly tackle a few more questions. I saw something on TV about an approach offered in America. Why is it not offered here? Maybe we just haven't caught up and they're onto something. In Australia, we have some of the best supports available anywhere in the world. We're always on the lookout for new and better ways to support children and families, so please rest assured. In fact, part of the reason our team collaborates with colleagues all over the world is to ensure that we can work together to discover new and better ways of working. I can promise you that we're constantly on the lookout, and when we see opportunities to fill gaps or try things differently here in Australia, we partner with other organisations overseas to bring therapies and supports and programs and ways of working to Australia. And if a new support was to emerge that could genuinely help children and families in ways that are not currently possible, we'd absolutely let you know about it immediately, and we'd move mountains to bring it to Australia. So I'm saying this because I hope it can offer some reassurance. I firmly believe that by accessing supports in Australia, that you and your child are in no way missing out on other opportunities. In fact, we're incredibly fortunate to have the approaches, the supports and so forth that are available here, and in many cases are the envy of many people around the world. On the flip side though, I think this is, I guess, a very personal message. Please avoid the range of pseudoscientific services and things that are out there that are offered, and sometimes they're aggressively marketed to you. Many of these are hopeless and some are downright harmful. When it comes to raising kids, I believe that it's often what we don't do that is most kind and helpful to them. And so when you're ignoring or protecting your child from pseudoscientific interventions, you're looking after them. It's a perfect example of looking after them. So please stick with the mainstream supports where you can be sure of a minimum standards in terms of quality and safety and effectiveness. How do I know my therapist is taking an evidence-based approach? Well, as therapists, it's our responsibility to ensure that you're able to make informed decisions. So we should be talking to you about what we offer, the reasons why we think it may be helpful, the potential benefits, as well as the potential risks. Every time we do something, it takes away the opportunity to do something else. So that's the potential risk, something else that might be more effective or a better fit. Should be talking about how we propose to monitor progress and outcomes, and what we plan to do if it's not working in the way or as well as we all intended. But alongside this, we should be encouraging you to ask questions and for you to feel comfortable and confident to make decisions. You should always feel in control, and it's our job to help you be in control. So there are practical things you can do. You can ask about your child's therapist, questions above. But if they do not automatically offer this information, you can also look at the parent journey planner that's available with the National Guideline for supporting autistic children. But probably most of all, you can ask yourself if you feel like you know what is going on, that you feel you're being supported to make informed decisions, that you feel in control, because if the answer is no to any of these, it may be time to talk with your child's therapist and or explore other options. I've recently worked with a couple of different therapists who each time, at the start of working together, They went through all of this information without me asking. In fact, they each said words to the effect that I may be a good fit, but if I'm not, I can suggest some other options, because it's important that you find the right support for you, the right support for your child. For me, this type of discussion gives me every confidence that they'll be taking an evidence-based approach to the supports they provide. How do I get my family on board? Okay, so this is a very common question and situation parents and other family members find themselves navigating. I think the majority of conflict when it comes to getting family on board comes from three main things. The first is that people have different views and perspectives. What one person sees as a child developing differently, another may see as, just kids being kids. The second is that people have different experiences. For example, I regularly hear stories of parents saying, the therapist or the doctor said X, but she's never seen him at home where he does Y. The third is that people have different priorities. For example, some people may be more focused on a child's learning, while others may see participation in childhood activities as the main priority. My point here is that recognising that there can be good reasons for different views and perspectives and priorities may be a good starting point for getting people on board. It's not to say that people don't care. It may be, though, they just have a different view. However, I do know it can be isolating when family are not on board. It can be very lonely. It can be really hard. This is particularly the case when two parents are not in agreement. I want to be really careful here not to offer advice on relationships, as it's outside my scope of practice. But what I will say is that by taking the approach I mentioned in this presentation of looking at daily life across a fortnight, the mixture of activities and supports, and what could make the biggest difference in your child's day, and in turn that of you and your family members, it might bring the conversation back to basics. The world of therapies and supports can be confronting, it can be confusing or overwhelming, just as much as it can be helpful and supporting and empowering. And this is before we take into account other questions around things like diagnosis and all of the further complexities that can raise when there are differences of opinion. My point here is that perhaps, this is the perfect segue to the final part of this presentation and a better way of working. The whole point of me talking to you today was to share my views on what best practice looks like when working with autistic children and families. And I've encouraged us to focus on three things. The approach, it's got to be safe, effective and desirable to children and families. The experience, it's got to be responsive and helpful and respectful. And the outcomes, we should be focusing on children's learning and participation and their wellbeing. I hope I've provided some helpful suggestions here, and some of the ideas may resonate with you. But you might have noticed that there's one thing I haven't really talked about in the vast majority of the presentation, ever since the opening. That's right, I've hardly mentioned autism. My point here is that I've focused on issues, opportunities and decisions that are absolutely relevant to autistic children, but they're also relevant to all children, irrespective of whether or not they have one or more diagnosed conditions. Thinking about learning and participation and wellbeing through the lens of autism is very important. It helps us to understand how and why children understand and interact with other people and the world around them, and in turn then to tailor supports. But there is also an important role for common sense to play. Common sense is what enables us to look at the fortnight, to think about the goals and the activities, the mix of supports and the gaps, and then make informed decisions about what's next. Sometimes common sense can help reduce the pressure that as parents may feel to fill the week with activities targeting X, Y or Z, because you step back and can see the mix of things. The common sense can also come back into decisions about supports and help us. For example, surely no one will argue that children with profound autism who require round-the-clock supervision support just to be safe let alone to participate in all the parts of childhood, need and deserve that comprehensive support. At the same time, where a child has more specific or subtle needs, but a gap between them and their peers is emerging, they too should be supported. It's just what the support looks like, for what purpose, and how much will differ. I believe that by getting back to basics and focusing on functioning in daily life, we'll be in a better position individually and as a community to get the mix, the amount and the balance of supports right. So I'll leave it there, but I do want to thank you very much for the opportunity to share these reflections with you. And perhaps I can leave you with one final message. I'm, like everyone joining, I hope, am on a journey in terms of my knowledge and skills and understanding when it comes to supporting autistic children and their families. You may agree or disagree with some of the things I've shared, but I hope at least some of it is helpful. But I think, what we can all agree on is that by making time to come together, it's yet another one of the millions of examples of the things that you're doing as parents and grandparents and loved ones, and or as people who work with and support children and families in a professional capacity, to give every child every opportunity in life. So thank you for making the time. Thank you for what you do. Our next seminar will be held in August, and the details will follow, but on the screen you'll see a QR code where you can learn more and receive updates. Please do stay in touch, and I look forward to coming together again soon.